another to suggest that science can rely on and deliver objectivity.
I can't really conceive of how, in any field where science is applied to policy, you could eliminate the role of value judgments on the part of the scientist. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that's inevitable, and actually it's a good thing, because science requires value judgment to frame and make sense. So, for instance, the question you ask, question is X safe, or is it safe enough, or is it safer than Y, or is it the safest thing to do? There were 4 questions, each one of which would get a very different answer from science. And quite often it's left to the scientists to decide which of those questions is most appropriate. And when they make up their mind on that, which is often an implicit thing rather than deliberate, it'll be a question of value judgments.
But the Prime Minister assured the public that science would provide all the answers. A simplification that bothered the panel members as they grappled with the tension between fact and value, evidence and argument, in this scientific yet value-laden context.
It made a lot of people very angry that even while we were devising the processes which the government had formally put its name to, I mean, we'd been set up as the committee to advise on the relationships, the commission to advise on the interface with the public on this issue, and to hear these repeated statements from ministers that, which went on, that the science would decide the matter, was infuriating.
Too much weight is put on science in statements like that. The idea that somehow science can deliver a kind of prescriptive answer, which business and policy makers recently adopt and implement in some way. Science can't bear that sort of weight.
The interesting thing about science on GM over the last 5 years is how much it's moved away from suggesting this is a safe, secure, precise engineering, as it was originally called, genetic engineering, to try and imply huge precision and certainty. Of course, what we found is, as many scientists said right from the start, this is much less certain. We've discovered how little we know about the way things work and interact and effects of proteins, so on and so forth. So if the government resting on science, they found the things they're resting on actually become slightly shakier as time went on.
The Science Review panel was caught between the government's expectation that they would deliver sound science and challenges to the very notion of objectivity. With this tension unresolved, they began meeting the public in December 2002.
With 7 meetings held in public, the public would come along to those. We also had a number of workshops and discussion fora, 5 or 6 of those held right across the country in different parts of the UK. We encouraged the public to come along, get involved, to talk to those people who were very balanced about it, I would say, because some of the meetings that I went to, it wasn't just pro or anti, it was a mixture of the two. So I think that was quite important.
And the periphery, in the shape of the interests of nature, was brought explicitly to the centre of the process.
I'm sure I was invited onto the panel to represent in some way wildlife interests and to balance the committee. Talking to real members of the general public, picked more or less at random, meant that we were talking to people who had widely different views, cultures, and backgrounds in this subject. And I think the thing that was really interesting was that they were very interested in this subject. They thought the whole GM debate affected them, and they were eager to get more information. So those of us who went along, I think, were, had information sucked out of us by that jury. Now, I think the other thing is that it was very obvious that there were some people who talked to the jury who the jury trusted, and others that they didn't.
I was involved in setting up a panel. We just tried to get, they're going to hear all sides, and here's some experts from here and there and everywhere. And the experts who knew about the technology were from industry. And essentially the members of the public on the GM jury said, I believe a word what they say, they're from industry.
Anybody who is paid to have a view on this subject, whether they work for an NGO like myself or whether they work for industry, the public were a bit suspicious. So their view would be, well, you would say that wouldn't you? And they would ask questions to try to get deeper into the issue, and then I suppose it was up to us to be convincing to know what we were talking about. So there was an initial scepticism.
But should stakeholders like NGOs and industry advocate their own point of view in the policy-making process, or should participants aim at objectivity?
I said quite clearly, if I'm hearing this in Genetically, I can't say anything without going back and checking, because I'm representing views about something. And I said, I don't want to participate on that basis. I'll do it as me as a scientist, and I'll do the best I can. But I happen to be working for a company, but I worked in institutes. I worked for startup companies, I worked for other things. And the only thing that I can bring to the table is my integrity as a scientist and my experience and contacts to try and make the best of it.
The scientists found themselves in frequent confrontation with vested interest groups who regularly attended all of the public meetings. Scientists often contrasted their way of going about things with the methods of campaigning organisations. Another case of evidence versus argument. But who was arguing? And over what kind of evidence?
There were plenty of fault lines in the sense of there were plenty of axes of argument going on. I mean, I had some very robust arguments, and occasionally it wasn't without some friction as well.
Many found kind of an alien process in a way, having to argue with people who were many of them activists, and I think that made quite a few in the scientific community disillusioned about this form of engagement. The activist groups have very good organisation. They have sort of internet, email networks. The scientific community are not interested in campaigning, frankly. They won't be heard. They are kind of independently minded, and they will do, express their opinion according to their perspective and their conscience. The people that come along to these committees are mandated to take a view, and there's nothing you can do to budge them. You can, discuss forever, but that is their mandated position.
The power struggle between the corporate scientists and the NGOs on the periphery was itself subject to an even greater central power, the government.
It came to my attention that the move had been made by a senior figure in the British regulatory establishment on GM to have me removed from an advisory body that I was sitting on for a major funding organisation. And the grounds for this were, it came apparently after I made some effort to confirm it, were that I was taking a critical position on GM in the Science Review panel. So I felt that this was, unacceptable and highly problematic from not in my own point of view, really, from the point of view of how the science advice system should operate. So I went to Sir Dave King, who's the chair of the Science Review panel, and explained the situation to him, told him about the situation, and we discussed it. And to his credit, I think, he decided that it did indeed warrant putting on the public record in the minutes of the Science Review panel, which is what he did.
The GM Nation debate was born out of two government-appointed bodies, the Agriculture, Environment and Biochemical Commission, AEBC, and the Farm Scale Evaluation Trials, FSEs. Members of both, independent of each other, had expressed the need for further research. This is where participation was to come into its own.
Our idea, which was much more involved in this than simply using the evidence from the trials, they should not have been seen as the last piece in the jigsaw, and that it was really rather important, given the amount of public concern that existed, to try to find out what had generated that concern and what might allay it.
The government actually formally accepted that recommendation when they responded to the report, within about 3 or 4 months. But I don't think they fully realised what they were letting themselves in for.
GM Nation would be chaired by Professor Malcolm Grant, formerly with AEBC. He began by organising workshops where participation led to some interesting interplay between evidence and argument.
We tried to do it where people sat around tables and had their own discussion and debate, and eavesdropping on a number of those discussions illustrated to me just how far short normal debate falls of an actual interchange of views, and that forum around a table actually forced people to confront each other's views and actually to confront their own opinions when they're challenged for what was the evidence and what was the justification for what they were arguing.
The countrywide remit of the GM Nation debate was huge. The budget allocated by central government was anything but.
I think we ran the debate on empty the whole time. There was not a sufficient budget to do the job properly. And right at the beginning, we had two major arguments with the government. One was that they had completely undercosted the exercise that we were proposing to undertake. The second was that the time that they had suggested to us was completely inappropriate for necessary planning and execution and reporting.
The consultative exercise, consulting the public, was, I think, $250,000, which frankly is peanuts in government terms. And if you really wanted a really thorough examination of public opinion, I would estimate it would cost at least half to $1 million.
Finally, Malcolm Grant persuaded Margaret Beckett to extend his deadline and double his budget, although it was still inadequate given the task at hand.
You can't really expect to, in an adequate way, engage the public who, when pressed on this issue, do have views or are concerned, or are interested even in it, because it's food and people are interested in food and concerned about food. But in order to actually, switch those buttons on, you need to get to people and you need to advertise and promote what it is you're doing, and there was none of that at all, unfortunately.
It was parsimonious, it was cheese pairing, it was done to a limited degree, and I think the reason for that is because, quite honestly, the government didn't actually want too many people getting into this debate.
Public views on genetically modified food.
Nonetheless, in June 2003, the great national debate hit the road with a tiny budget and ambitions to take politics into unusual places.
Professor Malcolm Grant says he'll be dismayed if ministers ignore public opinion.
There were 6 of the first tier meetings in cities around the UK, and then it cascaded down, and the whole idea was that it would cascade down eventually to a meeting above the local pub or in the village hall or whatever.
At Birmingham's NEC, the first regional GM debate kicks off. Its organisers insist the government is all ears, but some in the audience have their doubts.
But I want to take part in something that I feel is not a genuine consultation.
Before the meeting even started, you had a whole bunch of people saying, why are we here because the government are not going to listen? It was a shame that the facilitator didn't have the opportunity to explain why they were there and present some of the information before it started turning into sort of a load of bunch of heckling from the back, and people had clearly gone with their own agenda.
Participation was low, not helped perhaps by being held at the National Exhibition Centre, 12 miles away from Birmingham city centre.
People that would just members of the public who have jobs and other commitments can't go to something that's in the middle of the afternoon. The NEC is not an accessible venue to get to anyway. We went along, there was probably about 100 people there. I would say 1%, if less, were people who didn't have the decision already made about GM crops and whether they supported them or against them. I don't think anybody went away from debate having changed their mind. There were able discussions that I felt didn't really go anywhere because most people were either agreeing with each other or stating completely opposing views and not finding any common ground.
The differences between the scientific and campaigning communities became ever more obvious.
One of the basic problems in a debate of this kind is that the kind of currencies of the different sides are very, very different. The scientific community largely approach it in terms of scientific reasoning. They do a risk assessment, weigh the evidence, they may ask for more research, which is what happened with the GM Science Review. It may ask for a way of managing risk. There are clearly value judgments. All judgments include value judgments. But those value judgments tend to be within a particular scientific and agricultural context. So that is essentially the currency of the scientific community. The currency of the campaigning community and the activist community is rather different. And I see that as principally one of power. Who has power over agriculture and the environment? And I think that's the reason why the debate, which began with GM, rapidly turned to questions of globalization and big business and so on. The two sides can never really have a meeting of minds, never properly understand the other person's perspective, because neither values the other currency to the same extent.
But perhaps such neat divisions don't entirely hold. Scientists do campaign campaign, and campaigners use science. In the midst of all this participation, some felt the need to express dissent, sometimes illegal. Ironically, the direct action of Greenpeace led to an even more relevant test of the GM case, when they were arrested for theft of the farmers' crops.
We ended up having the case for and against GM heard in front of 12 genuinely neutral and genuinely uninvolved people, not like the public debate actually. We sat down and listened to arguments for 3 weeks. Everyone had to tell the truth, because you're on oath in court, both sides of the argument, and everything everyone said was subject to detailed cross-examination by expert barristers. And it was the most extraordinary experience to sit through for 3 weeks, the most thorough, rigorous, unhyped discussion about GM I've ever been part of or ever expected to be.
That was a real jury, but citizens' juries have become an ever more popular part of the policy-making toolkit. In this case, there were to be 2 other models of jury. Did they enhance or frustrate the policy-making process? First, prompted by the low profile of the GM Nation Review, a jury was set up by a confederation of Greenpeace, Unilever, the Consumers Association and the Co-op.
We just used the electoral rolls, so anybody who registered to vote and hadn't asked their name to be kept secret, we actually route to a random selection from all over 2 regions of the country. One was Gateshead, and the other was St Albans in Hertfordshire, so very different into the country, different social mix, and we invited them to come on a jury. We didn't tell them what the subject was, but we guaranteed them we'd try and get them a voice in the debate.
There was people like me who were students, there was just people from every walk of life, from sort of upper class, if you want to call it that, from working class to everything.
The jury has to be informed. There's no point having these organisations just walking up to people in the street and saying, you know, give us your view on GM, and thinking they'll have an influence. They had to be informed, so that's where the witnesses came in.
I think I was the youngest on the jury, and basically it was just discussions. We had witnesses who would come in, tell us a bit about their stand on GM, what they thought. Then we would have time by ourselves to think of questions we may want to ask. Then the witness was brought back in and we could ask them their questions freely.
2 scientists flatly contradicted each other. In fact, several scientists did, but one of them said, for example, that a particular sort of technology called Terminator technology was a red herring and did not exist and would never exist. The next week, the witness came and spoke to the jury from the other side and said it absolutely does exist, will exist, and must exist for these companies to make money. And they said, well, one of you is lying.
And of course, there was the Food Standards Agency's own citizens' jury. This met with even greater cynicism than the GM Review.
The director of a leading anti-GM campaign group has accused the Food Standards Agency of spinning the results of its citizens' jury.
They've taken a pro-GM stance right from day one, and their own sort of parallel survey of public attitudes was a disgrace. It should never have been allowed by the government, and I think it doesn't reflect at all well on the agency that they actually did that. And they tried to distort the results. The way that the thing was set up was totally twisted, and they were heavily criticised for that by, I think, 12 or 13 large organisations in the UK, including the Women's Institutes, Consumers Association, various trade unions. There was a massive protest about what the FSA did.
What was very different is that they said to the jury, just answer this question. And the question was, should GM crops, GM foods be available on your supermarket shelves? Now, we didn't. We actually gave them a page which we explained to them, and this was agreed, this page of information was agreed by all the different funders, so both the pro and anti sides. And this page actually explained the political context to it all, said there is this decision happening, this is the history, GM crops are banned at the moment, and actually we introduced it in a different way, and we also let them have a choice of witnesses. So if they said we want an extra witness on this subject, we'd try and find them a new witness. So there were differences, and I think the results contrasted as well.
It's the first time I've actually been able to do something and actually think I've made a bit of a difference. I've actually had a good input in it.
So which of these juries, if any, got at the truth? In any case, frustrated by what he perceived as government intransigence, Michael Meacher began to go public with his own views.
I never saw the slightest flicker of any persuasion, any real listening to the electorate, to the population and to their wishes. And indeed, questions were asked by me and others, what was the point of carrying out this exercise, which cost public money £5 million, if having got the result, which said 85% of people didn't want to proceed with GM, if the government then decides to go ahead?
There's been more fallout for Tony Blair from his ministerial reshuffle. Michael Meacher was one of the ministers sacked, and he's launched what may be a very damaging attack.
Ironically, Michael Meacher's removal from the cabinet gave Malcolm Grant and his GM Nation debate the kickstart they so badly needed.
A subsidiary generator of column inches was the sacking of Michael Meacher once the debate was underway. We could never have afforded the publicity in commercial terms that gave us in the public eye. And that was, I think, an enormous stimulus to people's knowledge that a debate was taking place, and then to the take-up of public meetings that occurred, which far exceeded, actually, our expectations.
Six months and as many millions of pounds later, the findings of the farm-scale evaluations reached the various review panels. Soon, there would be a decision. But doubts remained. Had they asked the right people? Had they asked the right questions? The minister who had been responsible could now only watch from the sidelines.
By the time I left government, was sacked by Blair, by that time we, of course, had completed the farm-scale evaluation trials and the results, and the consultative process was more or less complete by that stage.
Michael Meacher had been replaced as Minister of State for the Environment. It was now Elliot Morley's turn for the hot seat.
This government made two promises. One, we will respect the wishes of the public. Two, we will investigate whether there's environmental damage. The actual evidence that's come out of these trials is...
It was always made clear from the very beginning that the GM Nation process was not a referendum on GM crops. We couldn't offer a referendum on GM crops because of the global legal situation in